Well, this evening's lecture takes us to a series of events, the outlines of which will, I'm sure, be very familiar. One of the most famous, if not the most famous, armed conflicts to have taken place on Irish soil, including two great set-piece battles at the Boyne in 1690 and Aughrim in 1691, and two notable sieges of Derry in 1689 and Limerick 2 years later. Even nowadays, when we seem to have to endure endless commemorations, 1689 and 1690 remain the best known and most frequently commemorated dates in Irish history. What I hope to do this evening, making use of the extraordinary range of historical sources preserved in the Robinson Library, is not simply to retell a series of well-known tales, but to try and direct attention to elements of the story of the war in Ireland in 1689 to 91 that may not be familiar. I'll be trying to put these momentous happenings into their broader context, to see how the Siege of Derry, the Battle of the Boyne, and the Treaty of Limerick, which ended the war, fitted into the British and European political scene. I'll also spend some time on people and events in County Armagh to show how the conflict affected people on the ground. I'll begin by taking the widest lens and putting the war into its European context. The War of 1689 to 91 was not simply an Irish civil war, nor even a contest for control of the three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was part of a major European conflict. The 9 Years' War began in 1688 and lasted until 1697, when it was ended by the Treaty of Ryswick, after peace negotiations in what was then called the United Provinces and is today known as the Netherlands, King William's own country. The 9 Years' War has a claim to be called the First World War, since it was a truly global conflict, fought out not only on mainland Europe, but among European colonists in North America, and even between representatives of the great powers engaged in commercial and imperial activity in India. The war pitted the greatest European power of the age, France, against a grand alliance of other monarchs who formed the so-called League of Augsburg. When it was put together in 1688, this league comprised the Austrian Empire, the rulers of Spain, Portugal, and the Duchy of Savoy, whose lands extended into northern Italy, and the Dutch stadtholder, William of Orange. William was not himself a king, but the princes of Orange, who derived their title from the small principality of Orange, or Orange, in the south of France, were hereditary rulers of the Dutch Republic, exercising many of the functions of a monarchy, especially in times of crisis. The King of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1688, at least up until November 1688, James II, declined to join. Though technically neutral, James was, to all intents and purposes, an ally, or rather a sleeping partner, of the French, who had been secretly subsidizing the English monarchy since the 1670s. The origin of the war lay in the military ambitions of Louis XIV of France, the Roi Soleil, or the Sun King. Louis had succeeded to the throne of France at the age of 5 and had devoted himself to building up the strength of the monarchy, symbolized by his great palace at Versailles, and of the French state through a series of aggressive military campaigns against his neighbors to the north and the east. He was keen to expand his realm in order to establish borders with natural geographical defenses. In common with all aggressors in international affairs, Louis presented this seizure of territory as a defensive necessity. But in his case, there was some justification. To understand why, we must look again at the map of Europe in the late 17th century and focus on the possessions of the Spanish monarchy. You can see those in a kind of green. They included lands on France's eastern borders along the Rhineland and the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, to the north. But it's also important to understand that Spain, although in decline itself as a great power, was ruled by a king of the House of Habsburg, and his cousin was the Habsburg Emperor in Austria. Austria was a European power second only to France. Emperor Leopold of Austria ruled a good-sized chunk of Central Europe and was also Holy Roman Emperor, a title which gave him influence, even if not direct control, over many of the small duchies and principalities in Germany. And here he is holding court as Holy Roman Emperor. Together, these two monarchies almost surrounded France on its landward side, on its landward side. Leopold was the most important political figure in the League of Augsburg, though for various reasons he was not its military leader. He had a much greater threat to worry about at home in the shape of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which had invaded Austrian lands in the early 1680s and had reached the gates of Vienna in 1683 before being driven back. Leopold would remain at war with the Turks and with rebellious Hungarian princes until 1699. The second reason was that the principal theatre of war after 1688 was the Spanish Netherlands. The physical and mental feebleness of the Spanish king, Carlos II, meant that leadership of the Allied forces there devolved upon the much more energetic and militarily competent William of Orange, for whom the struggle to contain Louis XIV meant everything. The very survival of an independent Protestant Dutch Republic seemed to William to depend on resisting French invasion. At this point, it's worth considering whether the 9 Years' War was a religious conflict. For the Dutch, and in due course for the English and the Scots, it seemed that way, and the propaganda produced on behalf of the Dutch and English governments depicted the war as a struggle against popish tyranny. Louis XIV certainly used religion as a weapon of statecraft and took a very hard line with religious dissidents within his own dominions. In 1687, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had provided a measure of toleration for Protestants, resulting in a mass emigration of Huguenots from the area around La Rochelle on the French Atlantic seaboard. They were the first political refugees, and many of them fled to Holland and England. Louis also began a long campaign against another, more radical body of Protestant dissidents, the Camisards in Provence. But from a European perspective, the age of religious wars was over. In the late 17th century, Protestantism was in retreat and mainly confined to the kingdoms and duchies of Northern Europe. Almost the only significant Protestant power on the continent was the electorate of Brandenburg-Prussia, which you can see to the right of Denmark, in the northeast of Germany. The once formidable Protestant kingdoms in Scandinavia, Denmark and Sweden, were in no condition to head a Protestant crusade against Louis. The Danish Empire was in decline, and the Swedes, who had championed the Protestant cause earlier in the century, were preoccupied by their struggle for supremacy in the Baltic with Peter the Great's Russia, on the map as Muscovy. Elsewhere, the Dutch Republic was a predominantly maritime power. And in 1688, of course, the King of England, James II, was neutral. So the League of Augsburg was from the first a Catholic-dominated alliance headed by Austria. And what of the papacy? It seems at first glance to be a paradox that the Pope in 1688, Innocent XI, was disinclined to help James against William of Orange. This is a coin of Innocent XI, and I should say now that this and the next slide are the only two slides I'm using which have illustrative material that cannot be found in the Robinson Library. This coin and the medals that follow are in fact in the British Museum, but the rest of the material I'm showing is all here in the Robinson Library. Innocent was an ally of Emperor Leopold rather than Louis XIV. The French king had acquiesced only reluctantly in his election at the conclave of 1676, and afterwards the two men had been at odds over royal claims to authority over the Catholic Church in France. Pope Innocent supported the League of Augsburg, and he did so partly because of his hostility to Louis, and partly from his overriding concern with the danger to Christendom posed by the Ottoman Turks. And here we have a medal which commemorates the so-called Holy League, which Innocent constructed to fight the Ottomans in the 1680s. So from on the left-hand side, you'll see the four main protagonists, and from left to right, they are Pope Innocent, Emperor Leopold, the King of Poland, John Sobieski, and the Doge of Venice, who provided money and ships. However, this doesn't mean that the Vatican supported King Billy at the Battle of the Boyne, as I have heard said, because Innocent died in August 1689, and his successor, Alexander VIII, was the candidate of the French and behaved accordingly when he was elected. All this meant that William had very strong reasons to intervene when James II's domestic policies produced a political crisis in England in the summer and autumn of 1688. And this brings me to the second of my contexts, the political situation in Britain. Popular antipathy in England and Scotland to the Catholic Church was fundamental to the prevailing political culture of both kingdoms and was grounded in a belief, inculcated through popular literature and preached from the pulpit, that a return to popery would inevitably mean the persecution of Protestants and the establishment of an authoritarian and repressive regime in church and state. Sermons on state days, such as the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot, recited a list of familiar historical examples: the Spanish Inquisition, the Smithfield burnings under Queen Mary, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, the atrocities committed during the 30 Years' War, and nearer home, the alleged massacre of Protestants during the 1641 Rising in Ireland. Louis XIV's treatment of the Huguenots in Camisard was seen as confirming the belief that a Catholic monarch would introduce an authoritarian and repressive regime with inevitable consequences: the loss of liberty, the suppression of parliament, religious intolerance, and ultimately the impoverishment of the country. So when James, Duke of York, then heir presumptive to his brother Charles II, a king with many children, but none of them legitimate, declared himself a Catholic in 1673, a large section of English public opinion was appalled. And here's a pamphlet from 1681, which purports to give an indication of what would happen in the case of a Catholic king ascending to the throne. Between 1678 and 1681, when this pamphlet was published, in what became known as the Exclusion Crisis, a faction in the English Parliament attempted to exclude James from the royal succession in favour of his daughters, Mary, who was married to her cousin William of Orange, and Anne. Their mother, James's first wife, Anne Hyde, had been a Protestant, and they themselves had been raised as Protestants. Mary and William didn't have any children, but Anne was married to Prince George of Denmark, and there seemed every likelihood that this alliance would guarantee a Protestant line of succession. Exclusion failed, despite attempts to whip up public hysteria about a so-called Popish plot to murder Charles and install his brother on the throne. This plot, a figment of the fevered imagination of some agents provocateurs, led to the execution of a number of innocent Catholics, including Oliver Plunkett. And here we see a pamphlet published in 1679, which you'll see from the first part, offers a further discovery and confirmation of the late horrid and treasonable Popish plot. The failure of exclusion was largely because, to conservative Englishmen, the whole enterprise reeked of the republicanism of the English Civil War. There were enough loyal monarchists in Parliament and the country to resist the demands of the exclusionists, who were portrayed as latter-day Cromwellians and would-be regicides. There was also a sectarian element to this political conflict between English Protestants, since the cause of exclusion was taken up by Protestant dissenters, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, and Baptist, in the same way that the parliamentarian cause in the 1640s had been identified with Puritans and religious radicals. Those loyal to the traditional principle of hereditary monarchy were also defenders of the rights and privileges of the Church of England. In any case, it seemed unlikely that King James would produce a Catholic male heir with his second wife, the young Italian Princess Mary of Modena, whom he had married in 1673 and with whom he had still not conceived a child. So Stuart loyalists were able to reassure themselves that even if the country were to have a Catholic ruler after Charles II, he would be a one-off. In 1685, when Charles died, the anti-exclusionists welcomed the accession of James II and gave him wholehearted support. We can see evidence of these sentiments in Ireland as well, in the correspondence, for example, of the Rawdons of Moira. Sir George Rawdon was a staunch churchman who was very suspicious of local Presbyterians. He'd been fearful of the agitation for exclusion and welcomed James as a king who, as he thought, would preserve the Church of England and the Church of Ireland. It wasn't long, however, before James began to change hearts and minds. He was, as one historian has called him, an old man in a hurry. And although he made no drastic changes to the religious establishment in England, his efforts to relax the legal disabilities imposed on his co-religionists were seen as undermining the Protestant establishment. Various statutes prevented Catholics in England from holding public office. James sought to get round these by using what he claimed was a royal prerogative of suspending them. When he issued a declaration of indulgence, again by royal prerogative, to proclaim religious toleration for dissenters and Catholics, and ordered that this be read in parish churches, a number of bishops refused to comply and were prosecuted. The trial of the 7 bishops took James's unpopularity to new heights. He'd alienated his former allies, while failing to win over Protestant dissenters who remained highly suspicious of his ultimate intentions. Worse was to follow. In June 1688, Mary of Modena finally produced a child, and not just a daughter who would have been third in line to the throne, but a son who leapfrogged his half-sisters and became heir apparent, thus opening up the prospect of a Catholic line of succession. And here he is, a little bit later in life. A small group of English peers and bishops, political moderates, wrote secretly to William to implore him to intervene. They were later known in English Whig folklore as the Immortal Seven, and not as one of my former students described in an essay, the Magnificent Seven. But they wrote to William to ask him to put his father-in-law under some sort of restraint and prevent James from going further down the road towards re-Catholicizing the country. They didn't ask William to set aside the rights of the young Prince of Wales, whom James's more extreme opponents alleged was in reality a commoner's son smuggled into the royal bedchamber in a warming pan. The assumption was that William, acting as regent, would ensure that the child was brought up as a Protestant. William's own motives are unclear. Certainly he was anxious to end England's neutrality in the war against France. He must also have been concerned about his wife's, and by extension his own, claims to the royal succession, though he was careful to keep any such personal ambitions to himself. At any rate, he was able to put together an invasion force and the ships to transport it, and landed at Torbay in Devon in November 1688. He was welcomed as a saviour, and his triumphal progress towards London saw King James's supporters desert in droves. The king lost his nerve and attempted to flee to France, only to be apprehended by some fishermen in Kent. The arrest was emphatically not what William wanted, and James was quietly allowed to go off for a second time unhindered. William and Mary summoned a convention, as yet they couldn't legally call a parliament, which offered them the crown jointly, and of course they accepted it. James found himself in exile at the court of Louis XIV. Now England and Scotland, which had followed suit and held its own convention to offer the crown to William and Mary, could be brought into the war on the Allied side. For James and his paymaster Louis, there was only one way in which this situation could be put right: to enable James to recover his crown, and Louis to neutralise this new enemy, and that was to send James over to Ireland, where his friends were still in control. James seems to have been less enthusiastic about this than Louis, and with good reason. Even if he were to establish himself as King of Ireland, this wouldn't take him very much closer to his real aim, which was to reoccupy the throne of England. Ireland was second best. It could be used as a springboard from which to invade England, but for this, James would need a fleet as well as an army. And a fleet could only be provided by the French, who could neither afford to divert resources nor be certain of evading the English navy in the Channel. However, as far as Louis was concerned, packing James off to Dublin with money and a few troops served an equally important function: to occupy William in Ireland and draw him and his army from the main theatre of the war in the Netherlands. This brings me to my third context: what was happening in Ireland? Since 1685, events there had followed a similar path to England, though with greater speed and intensity. James's accession, as we saw, had been welcomed by loyal Anglicans, and he'd continued the High Churchman Lord Clarendon, brother of his first wife Anne Hyde, as Viceroy. Things soon changed. The first indication of the direction in which his Irish policy was going was the appointment of the Catholic Richard Talbot, whom James had made Earl of Tyrconnell, as Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Army. Tyrconnell accelerated the recruitment of Catholic troops and the appointment of Catholic officers. For obvious reasons, this was perceived by Irish Protestants as deeply ominous, and many landowners promptly removed themselves to England. Then, in 1687, Tyrconnell was named to succeed Clarendon at the head of the Dublin administration, with the title of Lord Deputy. He began to purge Protestant judges and office holders in central and local government. A further measure to remodel municipal corporations, including that of Armagh, was the precursor to the calling of a new parliament, which would thus have an inbuilt Catholic majority, given that most Irish parliamentary seats were borough seats. By the time James arrived in Dublin in March 1689, Tyrconnell had established a largely Catholic administration at all levels and expanded the Irish army greatly, leaving James in a relatively comfortable position. But James's writ didn't run over the whole island. While the Jacobite government firmly controlled 3 of the 4 provinces, in Ulster and the counties bordering Ulster in the northwest, Sligo and Roscommon, conditions were different. The Protestant gentry in the north had not followed the example of their counterparts in the south and had held their ground, forming voluntary associations for self-defence. The activities of these Protestant associations was a source of intense frustration to James and his Lord Deputy. The most famous episode of this first stage and the Williamite-Jacobite War was, of course, the Siege of Derry. And here we have a print of Derry from a contemporary pamphlet, and you can see across, it's upside down in terms of an ordinary map. So north is at the bottom, south is at the top, and you can see on the way down to the mouth of the River Foyle, a line across, which is the boom established by Jacobite forces to prevent naval support being given to the besieged. Inside Derry, various groups of armed Protestants had taken refuge alongside the citizens. These troops included a detachment from Armagh, where volunteers under Lord Blaney had earlier seized the city before being obliged to withdraw. In an attempt to browbeat the inhabitants of Derry, James himself travelled from Dublin to appear before the walls, staying briefly in Armagh on his journey north, and summoned those inside to surrender, to no avail. And after enduring privations which were recorded in excruciating detail in contemporary pamphlets, the besieged were finally relieved in July 1689. Meanwhile, there had been other successes for the Williamites in Ulster, notably when Protestant volunteers at Newton Butler in County Fermanagh were able to repel a larger Jacobite force advancing on Enniskillen. This engagement in particular protected the northeast corner of the country and enabled the safe landing at Carrickfergus of the first detachment of troops sent from England, under the command of the veteran German General Schomberg, who from his bridgehead was able to organise the relief of Derry and the shoring up of the Williamite position in Ulster. The successes of the Northern associations and the defiance of King James by the citizens and troops of Derry enabled Irish Protestants to claim, after the conclusion of hostilities, that in the crisis of 1688-9, they had done as much to save themselves as the English Parliament and government had done for them. This argument was strengthened by a pervasive belief that the Protestant cause in Ireland had been under the special protection of divine providence, an understandable conclusion perhaps in a world in which the workings of providence, to protect and reward or to punish, was taken for granted. Politically, the idea would bolster a sense of independence and self-reliance, which would manifest itself periodically during the following century at times of friction in Anglo-Irish relations. The extensive literature spawned by the Siege of Derry, including a popular play on the London stage, was also notable for the level of self-justification indulged in by the leading figures, including the governor George Walker, whom we can see here on the left, with the title page of his pamphlet. It was also notable for the attempts of Anglican and dissenting communities in the city, each to claim credit for the defence at the expense of the other. Tension between churchmen and Presbyterians had been simmering before 1688 and reappeared as soon as the siege was over. For those in the south of Ireland, by contrast, the circumstances obtaining in 1689 were rather different. In an increasingly hostile environment, they felt themselves powerless to resist. The tribulations undergone by the Protestant inhabitants of the southern provinces, and especially by the clergy, were detailed in a pamphlet published after the end of the war by William King, Dean of St. Patrick's, and there you see the title page on the left, who himself had taken a resolute stand against the Jacobite government. A more accommodating attitude was adopted by the Church of Ireland Bishop of Meath, Anthony Dopping, whose private correspondence from this period is held in the Robinson Library. Throughout 1689 and the early months of 1690, Dopping was receiving letters from clergy in the south, which reported harassment of services by local Catholics and by French troops who'd now been landed in greater numbers. These petitioners looked to Dopping as a man who could intercede for them with the king. As we can see from the list of the members of Parliament called by James in Dublin in May 1689, and the first page of this is on the right, it was published in King's pamphlet. Dopping, you'll see, is one of 5 Church of Ireland bishops to attend, the 4 bishops there, and on the left-hand side, Michael Boyle, the primate, although Boyle actually didn't turn up, we think. After the Battle of the Boyne, Dopping had to work to recover his reputation, but he began promptly, being to the fore in welcoming King William to the capital, and seems not to have suffered, in the end, any serious recrimination. Dopping and his fellow bishops were not the only Protestants to attend the Jacobite Parliament. There were some temporal peers, and if you look under Earls, there you can see Charles Lambert, Earl of Cavan, for example, and Francis Angers, Earl of Longford. And there were a few members of the House of Commons, mostly from the south and southwest, from families with Catholic connections or ultra-loyal monarchist sympathies. There is, however, one interesting figure from Ulster, and indeed from County Armagh, and you can see his name on the right, Arthur Brownlow of Lurgan, the progenitor of the line of Brownlows that in the 19th century would produce the first Lord Lurgan, the builder of Brownlow House. At this time, constituencies returned 2 MPs. And whereas Walter Hovenden, the second MP for the county, was a local Catholic landowner of Old English descent, a rather small landowner at that, Brownlow was a Church of Ireland Protestant. He had been described by Lord Clarendon in 1685 as a loyal, honest gentleman, and had kept his post as county sheriff under Tyrconnell. He was broad-minded in matters of religion, encouraging Presbyterians and Quakers on his estate, and something of an antiquarian and scholar, with particular interests in the Irish language and in early Irish history. We don't know how he came to be elected, nor what he did during the Parliament, but his presence there is intriguing, to say the least. The fact that James should have summoned the Church of Ireland bishops in what was otherwise a strongly Catholic Parliament is not actually surprising. Writs of summons were sent to peers and bishops to attend the Lords, just as they would have been under a Protestant monarch. James wasn't empowered to do anything differently. However, it's also clear that the king was unwilling to allow this Catholic-dominated assembly to take an extreme line. He was opposed to the demands being made by his supporters to overturn the Restoration land settlement, replace the Protestant established church with a Catholic one, and repeal Poyning's law, which subordinated the Irish Parliament to the powers of the Irish and English Privy Councils. Such a radical programme would work against him in England and would convince the English public that he was not to be trusted. It would also play straight into the hands of his son-in-law. Nonetheless, there was only a limited amount of, that James could do to prevent his parliament from taking drastic action. He did keep Poyning's law largely intact, but otherwise was obliged to give way. Land was the most contentious issue, and he had to accept a repeal of the Restoration Act of Settlement. Although the Church of Ireland technically remained the established church, the Parliament passed an act of toleration, and the right to collect tithes was given to Catholic parish priests, a devastating blow to Church of Ireland clergy who depended on tithe for their income. The most damaging statute as far as James's reputation in England was concerned was the act which outlawed all those in Ireland who were in arms for William or had left the country. This was more or less a roll call of the Protestant landed elite. Not only did it naturally confirm these individuals in their opposition to the Jacobite regime, it seemed to demonstrate to the English public that James was in thrall to a vindictive Irish Catholic interest, and even that he shared their desire for revenge. And the English press, some of it primed by government ministers and royal advisers, had a field day with the evidence that events in Ireland provided. James was presented as a bigoted Catholic, his army as a bloodthirsty rabble, some of the horror stories from 1641 being recycled for this purpose, and his government as fulfilling the direst prophecies of what was to be expected from a Catholic monarch: a tax on liberty and property, and even the reduction of the people to poverty. On this last point, much was made of James's government having to resort to minting coins from brass and copper, popularly supposed to come from melted down ordnance, the so-called gun money, of which this is an example, as you can see from August 1689. The story of the military campaign in 1690 is, I'm sure, well enough known for me to make a detailed recapitulation unnecessary. King William's march south and the Battle of the Boyne, the plan of which you can see, are familiar to us all. One point I draw your attention to on the plan, which comes from an account of the war by an early 18th century historian, and I don't know whether you can see it, but you'll be able to spot it, I think, in the column on the left, is the way that the Jacobite army is described as the Irish and the Williamite army as the English. Of course, each side included large numbers of foreign troops, French on the Jacobite side, Danish mercenaries and Huguenot refugees in William's army. The real significance of the use of the terms English and Irish here is that from the author's perspective, and he was himself a Protestant, born and bred in Ireland, the Williamite cause was the cause of the English. It's a reminder that the sense of national identity pervading the Protestant community at this stage was fluid. Protestants might adopt an Irish identity in order to distinguish their interests from those of England, but in relation to their Catholic adversaries, they still thought of themselves as the king's English subjects of Ireland. The other illustration I have of the battle is rather different. Again, part of the Robinson Library collection. This is a large-scale coloured print by a Dutch engraver, Theodore Maas. But it was regarded as worthwhile to go to this amount of trouble to produce such an elaborate representation of the battle, a luxury item on the print market. It shows, I think, better than anything else, the very keen interest taken in the progress of the war, not only in Britain, but across Europe. In some respects, the Boyne deserves its fame as the decisive engagement in the war, since afterwards both James and William, in that order, left the country. But in fact, the war was far from over, and it was another year before the second major battle took place at Aughrim in County Galway. This is a map of the Battle of Aughrim, again, from a near contemporary pamphlet. The Jacobite forces had regrouped in the south and west of Ireland with a further infusion of French men and money. and the two armies met again in July 1691. The battle itself was a close-run thing, far bloodier than the Boyne, with between 5,000 and 7,000 killed. Eventually, the Williamite commander, the Dutchman, Lord Kinkell, was able to win the day after his opposite number, the Frenchman, Sam Ruth, was decapitated by a cannon shot. The defeated Jacobite forces retreated to strongholds in Galway and Limerick, where after short sieges, they agreed to capitulate on negotiated terms. Limerick was the last stronghold to be taken by the Williamites, and here we see a plan of the city and a prospect, both taken from a near contemporary account of the conflict. William himself was anxious to bring the war to an end quickly so that he could send more troops to fight in the Netherlands. Thus, the terms of the Treaty of Limerick, which brought the war to an end, were more generous to the Jacobites than the hotter Irish Protestants wanted. And in the following decade, William's Irish Parliament undid his emissaries' promises of religious toleration by embarking on a programme of penal laws. The war by this time had left much of rural Ireland desolated, especially in the south and southwest, and the damage done to the Irish economy would take years to put right. It wasn't only the depredations of the two armies, and in this respect, both Jacobite and Williamite troops were blamed for stealing livestock, impounding goods, and destroying crops. Especially in the latter stages of the war, with no real structure of government, much of rural Ireland was in a lawless and disordered state. Groups called Tories and Rapparees infested the countryside. These Tories seem to have been straightforwardly criminal, bandits or brigands whose numbers had been swollen by desertions from the Jacobite armies. The Rapparees, though often confused with the Tories, may well have been of a different order. Large groups of the dispossessed or homeless, many of them in clusters of families, roaming in search of sustenance and shelter, wherever they could find it and take it. This was certainly the situation in the Midlands and the Southwest, where the bulk of the fighting took place in the late months of 1690 and in 1691, and for which we have considerable contemporary evidence. The state of things in the north, and especially in Armagh and adjacent counties, is less easy to discover, but there are hints in the surviving documentation. The Rawdon's house at Moira was looted as the absentee owner was informed in 1691 by one of his Catholic tenants, who had done his best to save the most valuable items of furniture, including the clocks. The tenant himself said that he was going to France, seeing no hope of making a living in Ireland after the war. He was far from alone in this. The land agent on Lord Manchester's estate at Tandragee reported a general exodus of tenants, workmen, and labourers. By 1691, he was writing that the country all round was depopulated, and without a militia, it was impossible to keep order, especially, quote, now the mountains are open to shelter the Rapparees, unquote. The Williamite forces impressed men and confiscated horses. No provisions were to be had, even at sky-high prices, and all work on the land was at a standstill. Such were the realities of the war for those at the sharp end. What finally were the long-term consequences and the real significance of the events of 1688 to 91? In the European context, the consequences were momentous. Successfully supplanting his father-in-law enabled William to bring Ireland into the Grand Alliance, an accession of military and, more importantly, financial strength, which ultimately enabled the forces of the League of Augsburg to fight Louis XIV to a stalemate. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 would prove to be only a staging post in this European conflict, however. And after the death of Carlos II of Spain in 1700, a second war broke out, the War of the Spanish Succession, in which England took a more prominent role and Louis's territorial ambitions were finally thwarted. There were also considerable consequences in Britain. Leaving aside the essentially unanswerable counterfactual question of whether, without William's intervention, England would have become in due course an absolute monarchy with a line of Catholic kings, there can be no doubt that William's accession initiated a period of profound change in the relations between Crown and Parliament and in the basis of governance. William's commitment to pursuing a major land war on the continent, something that English monarchs had avoided for centuries, required a new system of public finance to guarantee the continued existence of Parliament and provide the means by which England, and after the union with Scotland in 1707, Britain, could become not only a major European, but a major imperial power. And what of Ireland? Well, clearly the defeat of the Jacobites ensured the maintenance of a Protestant establishment and Protestant domination of land power. But set in a longer perspective, this was actually a turning point that failed to turn. Tyrconnell had attempted to undo the effects of the Cromwellian conquest and the Restoration settlement. In the decade after the Treaty of Limerick, the status quo before 1685 was restored, confirmed, and indeed strengthened. This was particularly true in County Armagh. Protestant tenants, farmers, or tradesmen who'd left during the war either returned or were replaced by new settlers. As for those few Catholic landowners, hardly any of them had any land in the county to lose. A book of postings, published in 1703, and we can see an excerpt from it here, although it is, I agree, very difficult to see. But if you squint closely at it, you can make out perhaps one or two things. The book of postings, which listed the forfeited estates and who had acquired them, included only 3 names of forfeitures from County Armagh. 2 of these, Walter Hovenden, one of the MPs in 1689, and Brian Murphy, had small holdings in the north of the county, less than 1,000 acres between them. The third, Murtagh McGuinness, who seems to have held the rank of captain in the Jacobite army, held nearly 5,000 acres himself in the south of the county, in and around Mullaghbourne. But this was, as it was said, mountainy land, and the overall value was very much lower. Thus, the same landed families predominated in County Armagh in the 1690s as they had in the 1670s. The Blaneys, Brownlows, Caulfields, Copes, Dawsons, and Richardsons. In King William's first Irish Parliament, called in 1692, one of the county MPs was none other than Arthur Brownlow, despite his dubious record in 1689. As Louis XIV might have said, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Thank you.